The door of the Duke's study struck the wall behind it, and a maid in a plain charcoal gown crossed the carpet in 6 quick strides before any of the 4 men inside had decided what to do with their faces. "Your translator is lying," she said. "Stop the signing." Adrian Hartwell, 4th Duke of Ashbourne, had a fountain pen halfway down toward a sheet of folded parchment. The pen did not move further. Beside him, Mr. Felden, the slim, immaculately dressed polyglot the Foreign Office had loaned him for the season's negotiations, had been mid-sentence on the phrase concerning the bride's joyful acceptance. The phrase died on his tongue. Lord Camberwell, on the Duke's left, half rose. The Spanish secretary across the table set down his teacup with the precision of a man who has begun to listen very carefully. Through the long sash window behind them, late October sunlight lay flat and copper across the river, and a kestrel hung above the elm without moving. "You will leave this room," Felden said. The maid did not look at him. She looked at the Duke. Her hair, dark, was pinned tightly at the nape, and a smudge of beeswax polish marked her left wrist, where she had been at the carved chair rail in the green drawing room 10 minutes ago. Her eyes, the Duke would remember afterward, were the colour of strong tea held to a window. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said, and her voice held the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed this for a long time, without being sure she would ever say it. "3 of the words your translator has just rendered to you mean the opposite of what they were written to mean. I have been reading the letters. I cannot let you sign." Adrian set the pen down, carefully, as if the small black instrument had become heavier in his hand. "Out," Felden said. He had risen. "This is unconscionable. This is— Camberwell, ring for the steward." "I will ring for no one," Camberwell said mildly, "until I understand what is being said in my hearing." "What is being said," Felden snapped, "is the hysteria of a chambermaid who has read above her station. She's been listening at doors. She has— Your Grace, I urge you, do not entertain this for a moment. 3 weeks of the most delicate negotiation." "3 weeks," the Duke said quietly, "of my time, of His Majesty's time, of the Princess Caroline's time. Yes, I am aware." He turned, slowly, in the high-backed leather chair, until he was facing the maid directly. "You have read the letters?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Which letters?" She did not flinch. "The letter from Hechingen of the 2nd of October, the reply we sent on the 7th, the letter that arrived on the 14th, the reply you signed on the 17th, and the last one, the one the courier brought yesterday at 6 in the evening, that Mr. Felden translated for you in this room before supper." She paused, fractionally. "I have not read the document on your desk. I have not been in this room until this moment." Adrian's hand drifted to the signet ring on his smallest finger and pressed the flat of his thumb against the engraved hawk. It was a habit he had failed to break since he was 16. "Mr. Felden," he said, "is fluent in 5 languages, including the Swabian dialect of the Hechingen court. He has translated for my father before me, and for the Foreign Office for 9 years. You are saying that he has lied." "I am saying," she said, "that he is lying. Now, in this room, about a marriage you are 5 minutes from agreeing to. I do not know why, Your Grace. I know only that you have been told the Princess wishes to come to England, and the Princess has written that she will not. I know the words. They are not difficult." Camberwell, very softly, said, "Adrian." The Duke held up one hand without taking his eyes from the maid. "Speak the words," he said. "The ones you say have been altered, in the language they were written in." A silence, a long one. The kestrel outside drifted half a degree on a thermal and held. "Sie wird nicht kommen," she said. The German came out of her mouth as if she had not had to find it, as if it had been waiting on the inside of her teeth for someone to ask. "Sie wird nicht kommen, weil sie keine Wahl hat, sondern weil sie eine hat. Und sie hat gewählt." She let the words finish. Then, quietly in English,
She will not come, not because she has no choice, but because she has one, and she has made it.
That is not, Felden began.
The Spanish secretary, who had been silent for an hour, said something under his breath in his own language that was not entirely polite. Adrian had not moved. After a moment he said, in a voice the men in his service knew to be the most dangerous voice he possessed, "Mr. Felden, read me the third paragraph of the letter that arrived yesterday, as you read it to me last night, word for word."
"Your Grace, this is—" "Read it."
Felden's hands, which had been so still, found each other. He folded them at his waist. He began to recite.
The Duke listened with his eyes closed. When Felden was perhaps 4 sentences in, the Duke held up his hand again, and Felden stopped. "Now you," the Duke said. "The third paragraph, as you read it." The maid did not need the letter in front of her. She spoke the German first, 6 lines, perhaps 7, and then she translated. They were not the same letter. They were not, the Duke understood distantly, the same season of the same year. He opened his eyes. He looked at the parchment on the desk. He looked at Lord Camberwell, who had gone very pale and was sitting down again. He looked last at Mr. Felden, who had not moved and was no longer pretending to look at anyone. "Send for the household," the Duke said. "Mr. Felden, you will wait in the small library. Camberwell, you will sit with him. Don Esteban, I beg your pardon for what you have witnessed in my house, and I ask you to remain in the breakfast room until I am at liberty to speak with you. I will sign nothing today." He stood. He had to put his hand on the desk to do it. He had not realized, until that moment, that the muscle in his thigh had locked. He looked at the maid. "You will come with me."
"Yes, Your Grace."
"What is your name?"
"Inez, Your Grace. Inez Carter."
He looked at her a moment longer. "That is not your name," he said, "but you will tell me the rest of it presently." He turned and walked out of the room, and after a half-beat in which she breathed once, deeply, she followed him. The corridor was cold. It was always cold along that side of the house in October, where the long windows faced the river and the panes had not been replaced since his grandfather's time. A faint draught moved the heavy crimson curtain at the gallery turn, and the smell of wood smoke from the housekeeper's parlour 2 stories below drifted up the back stair and met them at the half landing. Their footsteps did not match. The Duke's stride was a long man's stride. She had to half-skip every 4th pace, and he noticed and slowed without comment. The polished oak boards under their feet had been laid in the 2nd year of George II, and they sang, very faintly, with the weight of every passing person. She had been hearing them sing under her own feet 4 times a day for almost 3 months, and had never been able to walk this corridor at any other pace than a maid's. They turned at the gallery and went down the little carpeted hall to the library, and he opened the door and held it for her, which she found she had not expected. The library smelled of pipe tobacco that had been put out 3 hours ago, and of beeswax, and of the particular Green River damp the room had at this season. A coal fire was making a quiet noise in the grate. He shut the door behind them and stood in front of it for a moment, with one hand on the brass handle, before he let go. "Sit," he said. She did not sit. She stood with her back very straight near the long table by the window, and folded her hands in front of her, in the way servants in good houses are taught. "Sit, please," he said. The please came out as if he had had to think about it. She sat. He did not sit. He went to the fire instead, and then to the window, and then to the fire again, and stood with his hands behind his back, looking at the coals. "How long have you been in this house?" he said. 3 months, Your Grace, since the 2nd week of August." "Who hired you?" "Mrs. Pemberton, your housekeeper. She advertised in the Ladies' Register. I answered with a reference." "From whom?" "A widow in Bath. The reference is in your housekeeper's office. It says I was respectable and that I left because the family went abroad." "Is the widow in Bath aware that she wrote you that reference?" A pause. She is aware that her husband, before he died, employed me as a companion for her grandmother. The reference, Your Grace, is in a hand that very closely resembles hers, but I wrote it myself. You forged it? I did, Your Grace. In how many languages can you do that? In 4. 5, if you count Latin. He turned then, not quickly. His face was not the face she had seen behind the desk. There was no anger in it. There was no fear, either. There was a kind of arrested attention. The look of a man who has been informed that the floor of his own house is not where he thought it was. Your name, he said. She did not answer at once. He waited. He waited patiently. He was, she would learn, a man who had spent a great deal of his life being patient with people who could not say what they had come to say. Inés, she said. Inés María de Castel y Almodóvar. My father is the Marqués de Almodóvar. Was. He died 18 months ago. He was silent. My brother inherited, she said. My brother's debts were larger than my father had been told. My brother attempted to discharge a portion of them by promising me to a man who was prepared to consider his loan settled in exchange. I took what I could carry, in March, and went first to Lisbon, and from Lisbon to Bristol, and from Bristol to Bath. In Bath, I learnt that the Foreign Office in London employed the household of the Duke of Ashbourne for certain matters of correspondence, and that the Duke himself was understood to be involved in a marriage negotiation of some delicacy with the German Principality of Hechingen-Sigmaringen. I read of it in the Morning Post. I came north. Why? Because Hechingen is a small house, and a poor one. And I knew the princess. I met her in Vienna in 1812, when my father was at the Congress. A breath. She is 23. She has been writing to her aunt that she wishes to enter a convent of canonesses at Augsburg. She does not wish to come to England. She is being told, in the letters she receives, that you have already withdrawn the offer once and reissued it on harsher terms. Your letters say you have done no such thing. Both of these things cannot be true. The Duke walked to the long table by the window and put his hands flat on it, on either side of where she was sitting, and bent his head and looked at the inlaid wood as if it might tell him something he had not been told. Why, he said, did you wait until the morning of the signing? I did not wait, Your Grace. I tried to send word 3 weeks ago. He looked up. To whom? To Lord Camberwell, by private letter, unsigned. He did not respond. I assumed he had seen the letter and dismissed it as a mischief, or that he had not seen it because Mr. Felden collects the post. Mr. Felden collects the post. Mr. Felden collects the foreign post, Your Grace. It is, I understand, a courtesy he has been extended. Your steward gave it to him to spare your housekeeper the inconvenience of looking up the seals. How? The Duke said, very softly. Do you know that? I dust the steward's office on Tuesdays. For the first time, something in his mouth moved that might, in another room, in another conversation, have been the beginning of a laugh. It did not arrive. He pushed himself up off the table and walked to the bell rope by the door and pulled it twice, short, sharp. And then he came back to the fire. Your Grace, she said, and she rose. I have told you what I came to tell you. I will go and pack my things. If you wish to send for the magistrate, I will not run. Sit, he said. You will not be sent for the magistrate. Not by me. Not today. She sat. He looked at her then for a long enough moment that she felt the color in her face try to come up, and refused, by act of will, to let it. You walked into a room with 4 men and a contract worth more than your name to interrupt a treaty, he said. Why? Because the princess does not deserve to be married against her will, she said, and because you do not deserve to be married to a woman who has been told you are a man, who reissues an offer on harsher terms. He absorbed that. He did not answer. The bell brought a footman, and the Duke gave instructions in a voice that was lower than usual and just as steady. and then he sent the footman away again. He stood at the fire for another half-minute. Then he came and sat across from her at the long table on the far side, with the inlaid wood between them. "My household contains," he said, 173 persons, including the home farm. You are the 24th maid. I have not spoken to you before this morning." "No, Your Grace." "Did you come into my house to spy on me?" She thought about that. He waited again. "I came into your house," she said at last, "to verify what I suspected. I suspected from a single line of one letter quoted in the post that the translator who was speaking on the princess's behalf was lying about her. I came to confirm it. If I had not confirmed it, I would have left in October without ever being noticed and gone back to Bath, and you would never have known a Spanish woman had touched the silver of your dining room. But I confirmed it, and then it became a different question." "And the different question," he said, "whether I let you sign a treaty under deception, or did not." "And you decided not?" "I decided not." He pressed his thumb against the signet ring again, and looked at her, and something in his expression, briefly, was not the Duke's expression. He was 28 years old. He had inherited a title he did not entirely want, and a Foreign Office connection he certainly had not asked for, and he had been about to marry, sight unseen, on his secretary's translation, a woman who had reportedly written to him 3 times, and whom, apparently, he had not been writing to at all. "You did not have to do this," he said. "No, Your Grace." "Why did you?" She did not answer at once. The fire shifted. A coal fell with a small sound. "Because the last time I let a man sign my name to a contract," she said, "it was my own brother, and he sold me. I did not mean to be in a room where the same thing happened to another woman, and I held my tongue." He was quiet for a long time. "Lady Inez," he said. "Inez, please, Your Grace, while I am in this house. The other name belongs to a person who has not been here for a year. While you are in this house," he said slowly, "you are not a maid. From this moment, you are my guest. You will be put in the South Rose room. Mrs. Pemberton will be told you are the niece of an old correspondent of my mother's, who has come unexpectedly. You will eat with the family until further notice. You will have the run of the library and the morning room. You will not leave the grounds without telling me. You will continue to read every letter that arrives in this house, in any language other than English, and you will tell me precisely what each one says. Is that acceptable?" She inclined her head and said, "Yes, Your Grace," and he corrected her, quietly, with his own first name. He explained that she might use his given name when they were alone in this room, and his title, in front of any other living soul in the house, because he did not wish the household to think he had begun to behave oddly, and because he had a great many things to settle in the next 6 hours, and required her to translate 2 of them for him before luncheon. She agreed. She found, on speaking the corrected form aloud, that the syllables sat oddly in her mouth, and not unpleasantly. He rose then, and picked up a folio from the side table and set it down again, and opened it, and looked at it without reading it, and closed it again, and looked at her. He asked, almost incidentally, whether she had seen the kestrel outside the study window. She said she had. He told her that the bird had hung in that one place every morning of the past week, and that he had, against his usual habits of mind, begun to think of it as a sign. She asked him, very softly, of what? And he answered that he had not known until 10 minutes ago, and that he now thought, perhaps he did. He went to the door. With his hand on the brass handle he turned, and looked at her once more. "You walked across a Persian carpet," he said, "in 8 strides, with beeswax on your wrist, and changed 3 weeks of my life. I had not known that was possible until 10 minutes ago. I am sorry, Your Grace." "You should not be," he said, and went out, and closed the door very softly behind him.
She sat at the long table by the window for another minute and did not move, and watched the kestrel hold itself against the empty air over the elm, and discovered that her hands, in her lap, were trembling. She had not noticed. She put one hand on top of the other and stilled them, and got up, and went to find Mrs. Pemberton, who did not yet know that the woman who had been waxing the chair rails of the green drawing room since August was about to be installed, by the Duke's express order, in the South Rose Room. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the principal facts had reorganized themselves around 3 new realities, and Adrian Hartwell had not eaten. Mr. Felden was in the small library with Camberwell, and he had stopped denying everything an hour ago, which was the worst kind of confession, because it required no further questions. It merely arrived. The bank in Holborn, at which the Principality of Heckingen-Sigmaringen kept its London account, had received, between the 18th of August and the 2nd of October, 3 drafts on a Vienna house belonging to a creditor of Mr. Felden's, in the total sum of £1,400. The drafts had been received in exchange, evidently, for a guarantee of favourable conclusion of the British matter, the phrasing of which Camberwell had read aloud to the Duke twice, in case the Duke had not been paying attention. The Duke had been paying attention. The Duke had asked Camberwell, very politely, to read it once more after Felden left the room, and then once more after that, and then to leave the Duke alone for 10 minutes. And Camberwell, who had served the Duke's father for 31 years and the Duke for 4, had done so without comment. In the small parlour off the morning room, Inez sat at a writing table and translated, by hand, every letter that had come from Heckingen since August. There were 11 of them. Adrian sat across from her and read each English version as she finished it. He did not ask questions. He read, he set the page down, he took the next. By the 7th letter, he had stopped looking at her hands. By the 9th, he stopped pretending he was reading. He held the page and did not move his eyes, and after a moment laid it down very carefully and rose and went to the window. "She has written to you 11 times, Inez said, "and you have not once received what she wrote." "She is 23, he said, to the window. She agreed. She told him, in the same level tone she might have used to read off a household account, that the princess did not wish to leave Augsburg at all, that she wished, in fact, to live out her days in the canoness's house in the upper town, where there was a library, and where her aunt was the abbess. She added that the princess believed her dowry would be more usefully contributed to the rebuilding of the chapter house than settled on a foreign duke who had, she had been told by her own court, already lost interest in her once before the ink on the first treaty was dry. Adrian did not turn from the window. He said, into the cold pane, that he had not lost interest in her once, that he had never seen her face. Inez answered that she knew that, and corrected herself, after the smallest pause, to the form he preferred. He pressed his palms against the cold pane and watched a rook ascend off the lawn. The rook went up in the heavy, unhurried way of rooks, and tilted, and was gone. "What does she want?" he said. "What does she actually want? From me? From this? From any of it?" Inez set the pen down. She did not pick up another letter. She folded her hands. "She does not want to come to England," she said. "She wants the treaty to fail without disgrace to her father. She wants, I think, although she has not written this, for someone in England to know that she did not consent, so that whatever follows in her name is not laid at her door." "What follows?" Adrian said. "That depends on you." He turned from the window. He was, she saw, thinking again. He had a particular thinking face. He looked, for a fraction of a second, no older than her younger brother had been the summer before everything in Spain went wrong. And she did not allow the fraction to mean anything to her, and pressed it down, and reached for the next letter. "There was a clause," he said, "that I had insisted on. The dowry was to be modest. I did not want to be seen to be marrying her for the customs concession on the Württemberg salt. The salt was the point of the treaty. The salt is still the point of the treaty."
the salt is what your tenants need. Yes, the salt is what my tenants need, and what the West Riding Mills need, and what 12 magistrates' districts in this country need, and the alternative, which is the Danish concession via Hamburg, was offered to my father before me and was 20% more expensive and 3 months slower. We need the Württemberg salt. You can have the Württemberg salt without marrying her. He looked at her sharply. You believe so? The Principality of Hechingen-Sigmaringen needs the British recognition more than it needs the marriage. Their Diet quarrels every 6 weeks. They have not been formally received in any London capacity for 19 years. The princess is, regrettably, a respectable girl with no political weight whatsoever. Even her father admits it. And this marriage was conceived as the visible token of a recognition the British government had already decided to extend regardless. The salt was the carrot. The recognition was always going to come. He sat down across from her, slowly. You know this, how? My father was at Vienna in 1814. I was 19. I read his correspondence because he could no longer see well enough to read it himself. I've been reading European correspondence for 4 years. I do not know everything. I know this. I know one Foreign Office man, Adrian said quietly, who would say with great dignity that you are wrong. Mr. Felden. Mr. Felden. He is not the only Foreign Office man. No, Adrian said. He is not. He looked at the 11 letters on the table. He looked at her hands. He looked, after a moment, at her face. I'm going to propose a thing to you, he said, and I would like you to consider it carefully before you answer. She caught herself in the wrong form of address again and corrected it without prompting. He marked the correction with the smallest movement of his head and went on. He told her, in a single steady stretch of speech, that he intended to ride for London at midnight and would be 3 days. He would leave Camberwell here at the house with Felden. He would see 2 men at the Foreign Office whose names he was not yet at liberty to give her, and he would return on the Saturday. He wished her, when he returned, to be here. He wished, further, on the Sunday morning, for her to dictate to him in her own hand, in 3 languages, the letter the Princess Caroline ought properly to have received from him in the previous week, and for that letter to be sent. And then, he said, he wished to begin again, to negotiate the salt, to recognize the principality, to decline the marriage on terms that did not disgrace her father, to tell the princess, by way of one private letter to her aunt at the canoness's house in Augsburg, that no one in this country had wished her any harm, and that she might consider the British matter closed. She said it was generous. He said it was not generous. It was correct, and there was a difference, and she knew the difference, and that was why she had come up the corridor that morning and broken down a door. She found she could not answer. She nodded once. He asked whether she would stay, and she said that she would. He rose then, and hesitated for the space of a single drawn breath, and went on. He had one further thing to ask, he told her, and she might refuse it without any consequence whatever to the offer he had just made. She bid him ask it. He did not look at her when he said it. In London, when I see those 2 men, I will be asked who alerted me. I will be asked because the alteration of foreign correspondence in the office of a peer of the realm is a matter on which the Foreign Office takes a particular view. I would prefer not to give them your name. I would prefer to tell them that I noticed the discrepancy myself. I am willing to do this, but I am asking you whether you would prefer me to use your name. Some women in your position would. The recognition is not nothing. She asked him, very quietly, please not to use her name. He answered that he would not. She thanked him. He told her, with the smallest formal courtesy, that she was welcome, and paused at the door. Mrs. Pemberton has made you up a fire in the South Rose room. The chambermaid you knew yesterday is putting your trunk on the press. If anyone in the household speaks to you with insolence, you will tell me. You will not endure it. She told him, in the matter-of-fact tone she might have used to give him the day of the week, that she had endured worse. He said, after a moment, that he imagined she had, that he should still prefer that she not endure it in his house. He went out. The door clicked shut. The fire in the small parlour dropped a coal, and Ines sat at the writing table and looked at her own hand resting on the topmost letter from Häckingen, and noticed that her thumb was moving, very slightly, against the paper, in time with a pulse she had not been aware of for 19 months. The hours that followed were the slowest hours Ines had known in 19 months. She translated the 11 Häckingen letters by lamplight in the parlour, and watched the shape of a deception she had carried in her head for 3 months become a shape on paper, line by line, in 2 languages, in her own hand. She watched Adrian read each translation without once interrupting, and noted, distantly, the way his jaw set fractionally tighter at the 3rd letter, and stopped setting at all by the 7th, as if the muscle had given up the project of containing what was inside it. She translated. She wrote. She did not look at the clock. The room smelled of beeswax and ink, and the faint metallic tang of the pewter inkwell. The fire in the grate burnt down twice, and was made up twice, by a footman who came in without knocking and went out the same way. Outside the parlour window, a thin, late-afternoon light was beginning to retreat across the lawn toward the river. She did not notice it go. The wind came up around 5, a thin, northeast wind that shook the last yellow leaves out of the limes along the avenue and carried them in flat, curling drifts across the gravel. The lamps in the long corridor were lit early. The footman, who had been moving through the house all afternoon, with the particular soft tread of men who have been told nothing and have therefore worked out everything, set out the silver in the small dining room with twice the usual care, polishing the pricket stems against their cuffs, straightening the napkin folds twice, lining the wine glasses to the precise breadth of a thumb. The cook, who had been informed by Mrs. Pemberton at 3:30 that there would be no signing dinner, recovered her composure inside 90 seconds and reorganized the menu around a partridge she had been keeping back for Friday. She dispatched the kitchen boy to the still room for 2 preserved quinces. She called the second housemaid up to chop herbs, and in the time the Duke's carriage took to be brought round to the front of the house she had built, out of an aborted state occasion and a partridge, the kind of supper a woman of her standing could be quietly proud of. None of this was visible from above the green baize door. None of it needed to be. The household, which had reorganized itself around the absence of a treaty as a great body of water reorganizes itself around the unexpected withdrawal of a stone, ran as smoothly as it had ever run. By supper time, the household had been informed, by Mrs. Pemberton in person, that Miss Carter, who would now be addressed as Miss Carter and not as Inez, was a connection of Her Grace, the late Duchess, and would be accommodated in the South Rose room until further notice. The footman received this news with the practiced blankness of men who had served the family for long enough to recognize an instruction not to ask. The other maids did not speak of it in front of the housekeeper. They spoke of it everywhere else. By 8:30, Edith, the second housemaid, had made up 4 entirely contradictory theories, none of which were correct, and all of which placed the new Miss Carter in a more interesting light than the actual truth, which Edith would not have believed if she had been told it. In the South Rose room, Inez stood for some time at the window with her hands folded in front of her, and watched the lights of the Duke's carriage pull away down the long avenue and disappear at the bend. Then she crossed to the dressing table, opened the small leather notebook she had been carrying inside her bodice for 19 months, and wrote, in Spanish, in a hand that had begun to shake only after the danger was over, «He sabido que ya no soy invisible. No sé si es un alivio o el principio del próximo error. I have learned that I am no longer invisible. I do not know whether that is a relief or the beginning of the next mistake." Then she put the notebook under the pillow and turned down the lamp and undressed, and lay in a bed that had a feather mattress for the first time in 19 months, and did not sleep until very late. 3 days passed. Adrian was in London. He had ridden out at midnight in his second-best coat, with 2 grooms behind him and a small leather case strapped to his saddle. The case contained the 11 Häckingen letters, the 11 English translations Inez had written in her small, precise hand by lamplight in the parlour, and a private note Camberwell had folded twice and sealed with his own ring. The roads south of the river were poor at that season. Late October had turned them to a porridge of mud and flint, and he had reached the post house at Hatfield by 4 in the morning, slept 3 hours in his boots, swallowed a cup of black coffee that tasted of grit, and ridden the rest of the way to town in a thin, grey rain that did not stop until he was at the door of the Foreign Office at noon. He had not, in any of those hours, been able to keep his mind on the road. He kept seeing a woman in a charcoal gown, crossing a Persian carpet, and the way the morning light had laid itself flat along the cuff of her wrist, where the beeswax had marked her. He kept hearing a German sentence, delivered by a voice that had not had to find the language, and a Spanish sentence, delivered by a voice that had had to find the courage. He had not, until that ride, understood that these had been the same sentence. The household, which should have been reorienting itself around the absence of a treaty signing and the presence of a Spanish lady who had until Wednesday been a chambermaid, did so with the elegance of a great house that has had 8 generations of practice at not appearing to notice anything unusual. Mr. Felden, in his rooms at the Black Lion in the village, was guarded politely by 2 of Camberwell's men, and was not heard from. Lord Camberwell himself remained in residence, dined at the long table with Inez as if he had been doing it for years, and on the second evening, while pouring her a small glass of port he had ascertained she preferred to Madeira, asked her, in French, whether she had ever met one of his cousins at the Spanish embassy in 1812, and when she answered, in the same tongue, that she had, and named the cousin's wife, and described the morning room of the embassy in Mayfair, the old man laughed once, shortly, and said in English, "Well then, my dear, welcome." By the second morning, she had begun to walk the gallery. It was the longest gallery in the house, glazed on the south side with 20 narrow windows, hung on the north with portraits the Duke had inherited and had not altered. She walked it because the room was too cold to read in, and the morning room had become, since the staff had begun to call her Miss, a place where she felt watched. She walked it because her body was unaccustomed to having nowhere it had to be. She walked it because she wanted to be somewhere, in this house, that did not require her to make a choice for an entire hour. On the first morning of those 3 days, she walked the gallery alone. The light in the gallery was a pale October light, very clear, and it lay long down the polished oak and broke against the gilt frames of the portraits in narrow stripes. The dust in the bars of light moved very slowly. The portraits looked at nothing in particular. She paced the length of the room, from the great chimney-piece at the south end to the bay window at the north and back again, 12 times, and each time she passed the third window, she stopped for a moment without intending to, and looked out across the river to the elm where, on the first morning, a kestrel had hung. The kestrel was not there. The branches were almost bare. A single thrush moved in the hedge below the elm, and then was still. She did not, that morning, think with her conscious mind about what she had done in the Duke's study on the Wednesday. She had thought about it for 19 months without doing it. She had thought about it acutely from the 2nd of August to the 17th of October without doing it. And now she had done it, and her conscious mind was, for the moment, finished with it. What her body did, instead, was walk. She walked because she had been still for 19 months, in one form or another, in the disguise of stillness, and her body wished to remember what its own pace felt like at last. By 11 o'clock she had walked, by Mrs. Pemberton's late account, the length of the gallery 31 times. On the second morning, walking the gallery, she met the Duke's mother. The Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne was 64, half Italian, dressed in a dove-grey morning gown of severe cut, and seated in a high-backed chair near the third window, with a small dog on her lap and a piece of embroidery, at which she was not, Inez thought, looking very hard. She had come down from the Dower House at Marlow on Wednesday afternoon, a footman had said, the moment the news had reached her of the cancellation. Inez had not known she was in residence. "Miss Carter," the Dowager Duchess said. Inez stopped. "Your Grace?" Sit, please. There is a chair behind you. The dog on her lap, a small grey and white spaniel of advanced years and obvious intelligence, lifted its head, considered Ines, and resettled. I am told you walked into my son's study on Wednesday morning and informed him that his interpreter was a liar. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Grace.
The old woman asked, with neither hurry nor impatience, in what tongue she had done so, in English first or in German first. Ines, when she understood the question, answered that she had spoken in English first, that she had told him to stop the signing in plain English, and that the German had come afterward, when she had needed to say what was in the letters. The Dowager Duchess marked this with a small considering hum and regarded her. Your English is the kind of English a Spanish lady learns when she has been governed by an English governess from age 6 or 7, and has spent more than one season at the court at Madrid before the war. It is not the English of a maid. My son did not, I take it, notice this in August? He had not heard me speak before Wednesday morning, Your Grace. No, he would not have. He does not pay attention to the people he believes himself to know. He pays the most acute attention to the people he believes himself not to know. It is one of his weaknesses. It has, on this occasion, served him. She set down the embroidery. You took a very great risk. She said yes, that she had taken the risk, yes, for a stranger, yes, at considerable cost to her own concealment, and at the further cost, she did not say this, but the Dowager Duchess marked the not saying, of every careful thing she had built since the morning of the 2nd of August. The Principality of Heckingen-Sigmaringen has, I believe, an embassy in London, which would be obliged to recognize you formally as the daughter of the Marquess de Almodovar. This would interest your brother. Ines did not answer. The Dowager Duchess waited. Yes, Ines said at length. Ah, said the Dowager Duchess gently. And so you have walked out from behind a piece of beeswax polish in order to prevent a marriage of which you should have known nothing, knowing that the moment your name is spoken aloud in any London office, your brother will find you, and your situation will become, possibly, worse than it was the day you fled. I did not consider the consequence in those terms when I went up the corridor on Wednesday morning, Your Grace. I see that you did not. I have considered it since. And I am willing to bear the consequence. The Dowager Duchess looked at her for a long moment. The dog stretched and resettled again. My son, she said, has gone to London to ask the Foreign Office to extend you a discreet protection on grounds he has not been entirely candid with them about. He will not give them your name, but he will give them a problem to solve, and at some point in the solution they will say to him, and the source, Your Grace, the source. He may or may not at that moment hold your secret. I think he will. He is, in spite of appearances, a man of his word. But if he should not, you should know that this house, and the dower house at Marlow, and the small house I keep at Florence, are all available to you. We will not give you up to your brother, child. Whatever else happens, we will not. Ines tried to speak, and found she could not for a moment. Why? She said, when the moment passed. Because my husband was a man, the Dowager Duchess said, very simply, who once paid a poet's debts for him, without being thanked, and never told anyone, and died not particularly admired except by me. And my son is his son, and you are a brave woman alone in a country you did not choose. And we are people who have always been able to afford this kind of generosity, and who consider it discourteous not to use the privilege when the occasion arises. Also, and here she smiled, faintly for the first time, I am 64 years of age, and I have not been this entertained since I came back from Naples in '92. Sit down, child. Have you breakfasted? I shall ring for chocolate. There are some questions I would like to ask you about the convent at Augsburg. Ines sat. She did not, she discovered afterward, remember very much about the next 40 minutes, only that the chocolate had been very good,
and that the Dowager Duchess had asked questions that were not at all the questions she had expected, and that at one point she had laughed at something the old woman said about the abbess at Augsburg, and that she had not laughed in 19 months. When she returned to the South Rose room, there was a folded note on the dressing table, in a hand she did not yet know. It said only, "Saturday evening. A." She read it twice. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She read it once more. Then she put it inside the cover of the leather notebook and changed her dress for the green wool the Dowager Duchess had remarked admirably went with her hair, and went down to the morning room to read the second batch of letters Camberwell had set aside for her. It rained in the small hours of Friday morning, the first hard rain of the autumn. Inez heard it on the roof of the South Rose room and lay awake for a long time listening to it. The rain came through the elm outside her window in long fistfuls of sound. The eaves above her bedroom dripped at intervals onto the lead of the porch below. She could hear each individual drop. She thought of Adrian on the road. She thought of the courier carriages he would by now have passed at 3 different post-houses between London and the gates. She thought of the 11 Heckingen letters in the small leather case in his luggage, and of the 11 English versions in her own hand, written by lamplight, by a woman who would, by Saturday evening, no longer be able to claim she had not deliberately altered the course of the treaty. She thought, briefly, of her brother, 2,000 miles south of her, asleep at this hour in the great bed at Almodovar, with the windows open to the night, because he had always slept too warm. She did not think of him for long. She thought of the Dowager Duchess in the dower house at Marlow, and of Camberwell, snoring discreetly at the other end of the corridor, and of the small, grey and white spaniel curled at the Dowager Duchess's feet, and of the kestrel that had not returned. She slept, at last, just before dawn. The rain had stopped. The first proper grey light of Friday morning was on the elm when she woke. Friday itself she spent in the morning room with the Dowager Duchess and a basket of lemons that had arrived, somehow, from a hothouse in Twickenham, which the Dowager Duchess intended to candy by her own recipe, and which therefore required Inez to peel them in long, unbroken spirals, while the Dowager Duchess sliced and pressed and recited, with a brisk air of professional affront, a chronological history of all the foreign princesses who had been sent to England by their fathers in the last 100 years, and the various unsatisfactory ends to which those journeys had been put. Inez peeled. The yellow rind came away under her thumb in long, fragrant curls. She did not, until the Dowager Duchess unexpectedly said, "Your hands are very clever, child," realize that she had not held a lemon since the last summer at Almodovar. She did not say so. She turned the next lemon in her palm and began the next spiral, and the kitchen door opened at intervals to admit the second housemaid, bringing in tea, and the wind in the chimneys had dropped to a low, even sigh that did not need to be attended to, and was not. The Duke arrived on Saturday evening at 20 minutes past 7, in mud to the knees, and asked Mrs. Pemberton in the entry hall whether his guest was at supper. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been informed by the Dowager Duchess in the most unmistakable terms that Miss Carter was henceforth to be received as a family connection of the first water, answered that Miss Carter was indeed at supper in the small dining room with the Dowager Duchess and Lord Camberwell. Adrian thanked her. He went up the stairs 3 at a time, washed, changed, came down again. He was at the door of the small dining room within 12 minutes. She was sitting between Camberwell and the Dowager Duchess. She was wearing the green wool gown, and a single jet brooch at the throat that he recognized with a small jolt as one of his mother's, and she had been laughing, quietly, briefly, at something Camberwell had said. She stopped laughing when she saw him. She did not stand. She did, however, set down her glass. "I am sorry to be late," he said. "Sit, my dear," the Dowager Duchess said. "Mrs. Pemberton, set a cover. Adrian, you have eaten nothing for 3 days. Do not pretend." He sat. He looked across the table at Inez. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said,
in a voice the Dowager Duchess noted later in her private journal as the voice of a man who had remembered something he had been trying not to think about throughout a long ride from London. "I have something to tell you both, and Camberwell already knows the half of it. If anyone would prefer to hear it after supper, they may say so. I would rather say it now." The Dowager Duchess bid him speak. "The Foreign Office," Adrian said, "has asked us to receive the Princess Caroline of Hechingen-Sigmaringen at this house in person. She is on the road. She will arrive in this house by Friday next, at the latest, in the company of her aunt, the abbess of the canonesses of Augsburg, and a Foreign Office representative. The treaty will be opened again, in her presence, in this room, at a small private signing. The salt will be settled. The marriage will not be contracted. The princess will return to Augsburg the following week with the formal recognition of the British government and a dowry redirected, by her own letter signed in Calais before she sailed, to the rebuilding of the chapter house at the convent. Mr. Felden is, this evening, in the custody of the Foreign Office in Whitehall." A silence. The Dowager Duchess prompted, single-syllabled. "And?" Adrian answered that the Foreign Office had been informed that the original alteration of the correspondence had been discovered by a member of this household, whose identity the Duke was not at liberty to reveal. His mother spoke his name, half query and half reproof. He answered, simply, that he had given his word. "To whom?" she asked. "To her," he said. The Dowager Duchess nodded once. She looked at Inez. Inez had not moved. She was looking at her plate. "Miss de Castel," Adrian said quietly. She raised her eyes. The Princess Caroline asked, in the letter she sent forward, whether the woman who had alerted her would be present when she arrived. She asked because she would like, if it can be done with discretion, to thank her in person. Inez set her napkin down. She folded it. She did it twice, although the napkin was already folded. Inez observed, almost to her plate, that the princess did not know her name. Adrian said no, she did not. That she knew only that someone in England had been awake and would like to look briefly at the face of the awake person, and had said it would help her sleep on the journey home. "Then she shall," the Dowager Duchess said briskly. "Look at it. Adrian, eat your soup. Camberwell, ring for the second course. Miss de Castell, you will sit on my right hand at the dinner for the princess on Friday next. You will be introduced as my husband's late goddaughter's daughter, which has the merit of being a thing no one in this country can verify. And you will speak German for the company, at the moment in the meal when the company has had enough wine to find it agreeable. Adrian, sit straight, my dear, you are slumping. I have not seen you slump since you were 16. Adrian sat straight. He looked, briefly, at Inez. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. The footman came in with the second course. The fire crackled. The lamps burned. Outside the long windows, the river ran black under a young moon, and a kestrel, somewhere above the elm, hung against the cold air, although that, of course, neither of them could have known. Friday next came on the wing of the first frost. The princess arrived at 4 in the afternoon, in a travelling carriage that had been escorted through the village by 6 of Camberwell's mounted men, and one rather conspicuous representative of the Foreign Office, in a dark coat. The princess was small, fair-haired, 23, and so plainly tired that Adrian, meeting her in the entry hall, did not bow, but stepped forward and offered his arm, and she took it gratefully, and let him lead her into the drawing-room himself before any further courtesies were attempted. Her aunt, the abbess, a tall, thin woman in the black and white of the canonesses of St. Augustine, came after her with the steady, unimpressed walk of someone who had been on a road for 11 days and intended to continue at the same pace until she got home. The Dowager Duchess received them in German, fluently and with charm. Inez, in a gown of deep amber silk that the Dowager Duchess had had altered overnight from one of her own, stood at the Dowager Duchess's right hand, with her own hands folded in front of her, and her face composed. She had not slept much. The princess, when introduced to her by the Dowager Duchess as my late husband's goddaughter's daughter, recently arrived from Spain, looked at her with an expression that, for a fraction of a second, sharpened. It was not a hostile sharpness. It was the sharpness of a girl of 23, who'd been a princess in a small court since she was 16, and had, in that time, learned which faces in a room were worth her attention. Her eyes lingered for perhaps a heartbeat. Then she dropped them. She murmured the appropriate things. She sat where she was directed. Tea was brought. The conversation, at the Dowager Duchess's deft direction, addressed the journey, the road, the weather. Adrian sat to one side and spoke chiefly to the abbess, who liked him within 5 minutes for the entirely unfair reason that he reminded her of a cousin she had been fond of as a girl. The Foreign Office man, whose name was Mr. Welkin, and who spoke serviceable German, took notes nobody could see him taking, and said almost nothing. After half an hour, the Dowager Duchess rose. "Caroline, my dear," she said in German, "you will wish to refresh yourself before supper. Miss Carter will show you to your rooms. Frau Aunt, if you would do me the very great honor of taking a turn of the conservatory with me, I have an orchid I would like your opinion on." The abbess, who knew an excuse when she heard one, rose. She and the Dowager Duchess sailed out of the drawing room arm in arm. The princess rose. So did Adrian, briefly, and Camberwell, and Mr. Welkin. The princess looked once at Adrian. She inclined her head. She turned to Inez. She addressed Inez simply by the name the household used, and asked her, with the smallest gesture, to lead the way. Inez led her up the great staircase, along the long carpeted gallery the princess had been given the use of, and to the door of the chamber Mrs. Pemberton had prepared. The princess thanked her, in German, and asked her to step inside for a moment. Inez did. The princess closed the door behind them with her own hand, walked to the center of the room, sat down on the edge of the dressing chair, and looked at her. "You are not Miss Carter," she said. Inez admitted that she was not. The princess asked her, in a voice that did not rise above the lowest register of polite conversation, to speak in German for the remainder of the interview, observing, with the small, dry humor Inez had not until that moment expected of her, that the walls in English houses were thinner than English houses thought. Inez agreed. She shifted into the second tongue without effort. The princess looked at her then for a long moment, in the unhurried way of someone reading a face she had been told about at length, but had not yet been permitted to see, and asked her, simply, how she had come to do what she had done. Inez told her. She told it briefly and without ornament. She told it because the princess deserved the version with no decoration, and because she had decided 2 days ago that if this moment came, she would not lie. The princess listened without interrupting. When Inez had finished, the princess pressed her hands together in her lap and pressed them against the silk and said in German, very low, "I prayed for someone. I prayed for one person who would be awake. I prayed for it for 40 days. You should know that. I was not, I think, expecting you, but I was praying for you. Your Highness." The princess asked her name. She would not use it, she said, where it could be heard, but she wished to have it for her own private use. Inez gave it. The princess repeated it once aloud, tasting the syllables. Her German mouth made the S a little softer than the Spanish S, but the name held. Then she said, more quietly, "Inez, there is a thing I would like to do. I would like, before I go, to thank you in front of one other person of my own choosing. I will not use your name. I will say only, this woman. But I would like the moment to exist. It is important to me." When Inez asked in front of whom, the princess named her aunt, the abbess, and the duke. Inez began to point out that the duke already knew the truth. The princess waved the objection aside before Inez had quite finished it. She was aware that the duke knew, she said, with the smallest and driest amusement Inez had heard from her yet. "I am also aware that the duke has been carrying your secret for 9 days in a London Foreign Office, alone. I would like him to be in the room when I thank you. I would like him to hear that he was not the only one who saw what was done. She looked down at her hands. And I would like, frankly, miss, for him to see what kind of woman a man can build a life with. He has been sold a particular kind of woman in the last 5 months, the kind who weeps and consents in 3 foreign languages. I do not like to think of him being left without a corrective. Ines did not answer at once. Your Highness, she said. Yes. You are very kind. She was in her debt, the princess answered. Then, more quietly, I am also a very small princess of a very small principality, and I have spent 5 months thinking that everyone who wished me well had been bought off. I would like, in this house before I go, to do the one thing I can usefully do. She smiled, briefly, properly, for the first time. My aunt will think it is a piece of devotion. She thinks everything I do is a piece of devotion. Netta, we are agreed? We are agreed. Good. Now sit a moment. I have not had a conversation in 11 days that did not include a representative of the Foreign Office. Tell me about Spain. Inez sat. She told her about Spain. They were in the room for half an hour. When they came down to supper, the princess walked beside the abbess and laid her hand gently on the older woman's arm. And during the soup course, when the abbess had said something quietly funny in German, the princess laughed openly, and the Dowager Duchess noted it, and noted the colour that came into the girl's tired face, and noted that the Duke had been watching her, without watching her, and was quietly satisfied. And at the far end of the table, Ines ate 3 spoonfuls of soup, and looked at the napkin in her lap, and felt the 19 months behind her shorten slightly, as if a window, very far away, had been opened. The week between the princess's arrival and the Saturday signing passed in the manner of a household that has been holding its breath without realizing it. The first frost had set in for good on the Friday morning. The lawns were silvered at 6, brown at 9, green again by 11. The head gardener brought in the last of the rose hips and laid them in shallow trays in the still room beside the cat. The kitchen ovens ran from before dawn until after dusk. Mrs. Pemberton walked the back stairs 3 times a day, with the look of a general inspecting a position she did not intend to lose. The princess took her tea in the morning room at 10, walked in the conservatory with the abbess at noon, dined in the small dining room at 6. She slept, the Dowager Duchess noted with quiet satisfaction, for 9 hours each night, which was more than she had done in 5 months. Ines, when not required to translate or to be present, walked the long gallery in the morning and read in the library in the afternoon, and at intervals climbed the back stairs to the South Rose room and wrote, in Spanish, in the leather notebook, what she had heard and what she had said, and what she had not, yet, allowed herself to think. The notebook was 3/4 full. She had not, since August, written a page in it that had not been written in fear. The pages of the new week were a different color of paper to look at, although the paper was the same. The fear had gone somewhere else. It had not gone away. It had simply, for the moment, stepped back from the window. The signing was on the Saturday morning at 11 o'clock in the long library. Adrian stood at the head of the carved oak table in his dark grey coat, with his signet hand resting on the corner of the leather folio. The princess sat at his right. The abbess sat at the princess's right. Mr. Welcome sat opposite, with the British copy of the redrafted treaty, the customs concession on the Württemberg salt clearly listed in the 2nd clause, and the recognition of the principality in the 3rd. Lord Camberwell sat at the foot. The Dowager Duchess stood by the fire, with one hand on the marble mantel, dressed in plum velvet, and looked exactly like a portrait of herself at 30. Ines stood by the long window, in the deep amber silk gown the Dowager Duchess had insisted she wear again, with the jet brooch at the throat, and a single string of garnets she did not remember being put around her neck. The early frost on the lawn outside was beginning to give way under the sun. The kestrel was not at the elm. The kestrel had not been at the elm since the morning of the original signing.
Mr. Welkin read the treaty out in English, then in German. The princess listened. Once, at the second clause, she nodded almost imperceptibly. Once, at the fifth, she glanced at Ines, who translated a single phrase under her breath without anyone noticing except the princess, who nodded again. The reading concluded. The princess took the pen first. She signed her name, in her own German hand, with a small curl at the K that the abbess permitted herself a very small smile at. She passed the pen to Adrian. Adrian signed. He pressed the seal. Mr. Welkin took the document, examined it, set it down, and rose. "Your Grace, Your Highness, Your Reverence," he said. "It is done." The princess inclined her head. She did not rise at once. She looked at Adrian. She looked at the Dowager Duchess. She looked at the abbess. Then she rose. Adrian and Welkin and Camberwell rose with her, and the abbess.
"Lady Marchesa," the princess said in German, addressing the Dowager Duchess, "I owe you many things, but the chief of them is the courtesy of your house to a woman who arrived in it tired, and who has not been required in any moment under your roof to pretend to be anything other than tired. I shall not forget it."
"Caroline," the Dowager Duchess said, "you are gracious."
"I have one further matter," the princess said. She turned. She did not address Adrian. She addressed the room. "There is a woman in this house," she said, "who took a very great risk on my behalf, who altered the course of a treaty by a single morning's act of conscience, and who has not been thanked. Out of her own modesty, she will not allow her name to be spoken in this room. I respect her wish, but I will not leave this house without saying what I have come here in part to say." She turned then, and walked the length of the carved oak table, and stopped in front of Ines. Ines had set her hands at her sides. She did not look down. "Madame," the princess said, "I shall be in your debt for the remainder of my life. I am a small princess of a small house, and my debts are small things. I acknowledge them publicly, however, when I owe them. I owe you mine. If at any time, in any country, you require a friend, you will find one in the Canoness's house in the upper town of Augsburg. The aunt who sits at the table here is a witness. She has been instructed. So has the abbess of every house belonging to our chapter from Bregenz to the Tyrol. You will be received. You will be sheltered. You will be, in any house bearing our name, our sister. If it pleases God, I shall die within those walls. And if you ever stand at the gate of any of them, you will be received as I would be received, on my own name, without question. That is what I came to say." She held out her hand. Ines took it. The princess pressed her hand once, hard, and let go. "Thank you," Ines said, in German, and her voice did not entirely manage to be steady. "Bitte," said the princess, very simply, and turned, and walked back to the table, and sat. The abbess, who had understood every word, and was, the Dowager Duchess noted, frowning very slightly out of pure professional respect for what she had just witnessed, sat as well. The princess looked once at Adrian. Adrian had not moved. He had not for a moment breathed. "Your Grace," the princess said pleasantly, in English, "I believe a glass of wine is now permitted, if your mother's housekeeper will be so good. I am thirsty." "Yes," Adrian said. "Yes, of course." The wine was brought. The party rose by degrees. The princess crossed to the Dowager Duchess, and the Dowager Duchess took her arm. The abbess was drawn aside by Camberwell on a question of canon law she found genuinely diverting. Mr. Welkin folded the treaty into its leather folio, and bore it away to the small library to be sealed. Adrian stood at the head of the table for a moment, alone. Then he crossed the room. He stopped a pace from her. He did not speak at once. Then, very low, he said that he had not known the princess would do what she had just done. He had not, he added, after the smallest pause, arranged it. Ines answered that she knew this,
and that the princess had been right to do it. She said, after a further moment, that the princess was 23 years old and braver, Your Grace, than she had let herself imagine. And she corrected the form of address, before he could, to the form he had been quietly insisting on for a fortnight. He looked at her. The frost on the lawn was almost gone. The principal facts had reorganized themselves, again, around a new set of realities, and he was, at this moment, only just beginning to understand which new realities. "In a week," he said, "the household will return to its usual order. The princess will be in Calais. Welkin will be in Whitehall. My mother will be in the dower house at Marlow with her dog and her embroidery. Camberwell will be in his rooms in town. You will be in the South Rose room, or in the morning room, or in the long gallery. I do not know what I would like to ask you. I know that I have not been able to think clearly about anything except this room, and you in it, for 9 days. I am telling you this badly. I shall do better in a week." She looked at him. "You have a week, Adrian," she said, "and so do I." He nodded once. "Yes," he said, "we do." He turned. He went to the princess, and the Dowager Duchess and his mother's left hand, and put his hand for a moment at the small of his mother's back, and asked the princess, in German, with the politeness of a man who knew she would understand the gesture, whether she would care for a quarter-hour in the conservatory before her carriage was called. The princess said she would. She took his arm. They went out. The abbess and Camberwell followed shortly. Mr. Welkin returned with the sealed folio and disappeared into the library again. The Dowager Duchess crossed the room to Inez and took her by the wrist and led her, without comment, to the window, and stood beside her. "Well, child," she said quietly, and Inez answered with the steady form of address she had at last grown into. The Dowager Duchess told her, without looking away from the window, that her son was not a man who knew how to begin a sentence of the kind he was now obliged to begin, that he had not, in his life, had occasion to learn, and that she would have to be patient with him, and to allow him to be slow. Inez said, very quietly, that she knew, and that she would. The Dowager Duchess looked at the lawn for a moment, and at the place where the frost was retreating along the boxwood hedge, and at the distant point on the avenue, at which a carriage would, in not too many hours, set off for Calais, and another carriage would not, this time, return to London, but would remain in the coach-house, because its master had nowhere he urgently needed to be. "Good," she said. The week that followed was the strangest of Adrian Hartwell's adult life, and the simplest. The princess departed for Calais on Sunday morning, with the abbess beside her in the travelling carriage, and Camberwell's 2 best men riding ahead. She left a small packet for Inez in the Dowager Duchess's hand that contained a silver cross from her own throat and a folded note in German. The note said, "Sister, Augsburg waits. K." The cross was put on the dressing table in the South Rose room, and, in the hour after the carriage's wheels had stopped being audible at the bend, Inez sat for a long time with it in her hand, and did not write in the leather notebook, because she did not yet know what to say. Mr. Welkin departed on Monday morning for London, with the sealed treaty folio in a strapped dispatch case, and a private letter to the Foreign Secretary in the inside pocket of his coat. Lord Camberwell departed on Monday afternoon, having dined on Sunday with the Dowager Duchess and Inez at a small table in the morning room, and having pressed Inez's hand at the door and said, in his courtly French, that he should consider it the privilege of his old age to receive her under his roof in town for as many seasons as she should care to come up for. That his wife, who had been dead 12 years, would have liked her enormously, and that he should, at her smallest sign, raise his hand for her in any London room. He went down the steps to his coach, looked back once, lifted his hat, and was gone. The Dowager Duchess remained. "I am not leaving for Marlow," she announced to her son at breakfast on Tuesday morning, "until the heir in this house has decided what it would like to be. You will not require me to leave before the heir has decided. Eat your kipper." Adrian ate his kipper. He had not,
since the previous Wednesday, been able to look at his mother for very long without feeling that she was reading something in his face that he had not meant to put there. And his mother, who was reading exactly what she suspected, had the courtesy to pretend not to be doing it. She buttered her toast. She fed a corner to the dog. She informed him that she intended to take Mr. Castell through the long gallery after breakfast and identify by name every ancestor on the north wall whose history could be relied upon to scandalize a Catholic, and that he might, if he chose, join them at the second window for the introduction to his great-grandmother, who had eloped with a French abbé. Adrian said he would join them at the second window. He did join them at the second window. He stood for 10 minutes at his mother's elbow while she cheerfully libelled their forebears, and watched Ines laugh, quietly, properly, with her eyes, 3 separate times. At the end of it, when his mother had been called away by a footman to deal with a question about a delivery from the apothecary, he found himself alone in the long gallery with Ines, in the slanting, late-morning light, and they did not speak for almost a minute. Ines, at last, looking up at the great-grandmother who had eloped with the French abbé, asked whether the necklace was a true thing or a painter's invention. He told her it was true, but it lay in the strong room in town, and that his mother wore it twice in a generation and said she hated it, although his mother did not hate it at all, and wore it, in fact, for the one dinner each year that she most disliked. Ines asked why. He said only, to remind herself, and added that his mother had never told him of what. She looked at the portrait then in earnest. The great-grandmother had a calm, amused face, and a single ruby of considerable size at the base of her throat, and was painted in a green silk gown that no woman in any subsequent generation had been able to wear. Without inviting comparisons, no one came out of well. Ines said softly that she was beautiful, and after a pause, added that he had her eyes. He answered, with the smallest dry inflection, that his mother said so too. A pause. He turned away from the portrait. He took 2 steps along the gallery. He turned back. Ines, he said. Adrian. On Wednesday next, my mother will return to Manor. On Thursday, Camberwell will return for 2 nights to settle a final detail with Welkin, and then he will be gone again. By the following Sunday, this house will contain its usual residents. Myself, Mrs. Pemberton, the steward, the servants. And you, if you are still here. Yes. I have been thinking about how to say what I am about to say since I left London on Saturday morning. I have not arrived at a satisfactory phrasing. I beg your indulgence for the form. The substance, I hope, you will accept. She bid him speak. I do not know, he said, anything at all about who you would have been if your father had lived and your brother had paid his debts. I know only who you have been since the 2nd of August. I know you have read in this house in 5 languages without being asked. I know you have crossed a Persian carpet in 8 strides on a morning when you had everything to lose. I know you have laughed 3 times in the last hour, and that until 11 days ago, by your own accounting in a notebook I have had the decency not to read, you had not laughed in 19 months. I know that I have not, in my own house, slept since Wednesday, not because I have been distressed, but because I have been thinking, in detail, about the precise moment in any given evening at which you might come into the room. I find that I do not wish, on Wednesday next, for there to be any further uncertainty in this house about what you and I are to each other. Adrian, I'm not asking you to marry me. Not today. I have learnt, very recently, what it is to ask a woman to marry me without ever having heard her speak. I shall not do it again. I am asking, instead, whether you would consent to be courted. By me. In this house. At my mother's table. On my mother's terms, which are vastly more demanding than mine. For 3 months, or 6 months, or whatever interval you require. At the end of it, if you wish to leave for Augsburg, or for Camberwell's house in town, or for any other roof in England or in any country I can pay a passage to, you will go with my blessing, and a settlement that will keep you for the rest of your life, and an introduction, whatever you choose, that will not be retracted. If, on the other hand, at the end of it, you wished, only if you wished, for the conversation to continue, I would be the most fortunate man I am acquainted with." He stopped. He had reached the end of the sentence he had been working on since Saturday, and he had managed, with effort, to deliver it without his voice doing anything inconvenient. He looked at her. She told him, after a moment, that it was very long, and that it was generous. He answered both observations gravely, with the formal courtesy he reserved for the sentences he meant most, and said only that he hoped it was correct. She told him, in the same key, that it was. He waited. "On Wednesday next," she said, "your mother will return to Marlow. On the Thursday, I shall walk in the long gallery with you, in the morning, between the 2nd and the 5th windows, between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, and I shall tell you my answer. I should like, please, the days in between. I have been making decisions at speed for 19 months, Adrian, and I find I am in no haste to make this one without thinking." He told her, simply, to take the days. She thanked him. He repeated, almost to himself, that she would tell him on Thursday, and she answered that she would. He nodded. He did not, in that moment, do anything else. He did not touch her hand, although he had been thinking, intermittently, for 9 days about the precise angle at which her hand had laid one of the 11 Heckingen letters down on the writing table on the afternoon of the original revelation. He did not lean forward. He did not, in any way, hurry her. He stepped back. He bowed, very slightly. He turned. He went out of the long gallery the way he had come in. She stood beneath the portrait of the great-grandmother with the ruby at her throat for another full minute, and watched the dust travel slowly through a bar of sunlight, and noticed, without being able to do anything about it, that her hand on the carved oak rail had begun, very faintly, to tremble. And noticed, after a moment, that this was, in the new and unexpected register of her life, the trembling not of fear, but of relief. The days between Tuesday and Thursday were unremarkable in the way that the most important days in a person's life are very often unremarkable. Nothing in the house was different, except that the air, exactly as the Dowager Duchess had observed, was deciding what it would like to be. The Dowager Duchess took Inés on 3 further tours of the gallery, 3 of the conservatory, 1 of the home farm, and 1, improbably, of the cellars, where she revealed an unexpected expertise in port that she had inherited from her father and had been given few opportunities to deploy. She introduced Inés to the head gardener, the head groom, the cook, the steward's wife, and a tabby cat of advanced years that lived in the still room and was widely held to be the secret governor of the household. She did not, at any point, speak of her son's intentions, or her own. She asked Inés one evening at supper, however, what she would do, assuming her brother were to be made to understand, by the action of certain offices in London on which the Foreign Office could be persuaded to lean, that he had no further claim on her person. Inés, after some thought, said that she had not allowed herself to think of an after, and that she was beginning to discover that the absence of a defined after made the present rather difficult to inhabit. The Dowager Duchess nodded. She ate her trifle. She did not press the question further. Adrian, who had set himself the rule of not pressing any question at all, kept the rule with surprising ease. He saw her at meals. He saw her at the morning prayer the household kept on Wednesday morning. He saw her in the library, into which she had begun to drift in the late afternoon, with a folio of 17th-century Spanish poetry he had not known he owned, and which he must have inherited from his Italian grandmother. He did not interrupt her. He sat at the long table at the far end of the room with his own correspondence, and heard, occasionally, the small sound of her turning a page. Twice, when she rose to go, he rose also and held the door, and did not detain her in the doorway. The second time, on Wednesday afternoon, she paused beside him with one hand on the brass handle and said, very quietly, "Tomorrow at 9:30, in the long gallery, between the 2nd and the 5th windows." He said, "I shall be there." She went out. The morning of Wednesday came on very cold and very bright. A skin of ice had formed on the standing water in the stone trough outside the stables, and a robin sat on the rim of the trough and turned its head twice at the gardener's boy who came to break the ice with a poker. In the morning room, the Dowager Duchess took her coffee at the small table by the south window and read the Post, and made 3 notes in her diary in a hand that had been growing minutely smaller for a year and a half. Inez sat opposite her with a Spanish book open on her knee, and did not, in any of those 40 minutes, succeed in turning a single page. The Dowager Duchess pretended not to have noticed. At 10 o'clock she rose, and announced that Crampton, her coachman, would have the horses harnessed by 4, and that she therefore intended to take a long bath at 3 in the small bathroom above the kitchen, and would not be available between those hours for any conversation whatever. She said this to no one in particular. She kissed Inez on the forehead in passing. She went out. The Dowager Duchess departed for Marlow on Wednesday evening at 5 o'clock. She kissed Adrian on both cheeks at the foot of the front steps. She kissed Inez lightly on one cheek, and held her by both forearms for a moment, and said, in Italian, "Coraggio, figlia." She got into the coach. She lifted one gloved hand at the carriage window. The coach pulled away. The lamps in the entry hall were lit. Adrian and Inez stood for a moment side by side in the doorway, watching the coach round the bend, and then they did not look at each other, and they went, by separate stairs, to dress for supper, which they took in the small dining room together, in a silence that had nothing in it of awkwardness, and a great deal in it, the footman noted, of attention. They parted in the hall after supper. He bowed. She inclined her head. She went up the stairs to the South Rose room. He went into the library. He read for an hour without taking in a single sentence. He went to bed at 11. He did not sleep until 2. He rose at 6, dressed, breakfasted, paced, and was in the long gallery, between the 2nd and 5th windows, at 25 minutes past 9. She was already there. She was wearing the green wool gown. The morning sun, low in late October, came in slantwise through the south windows, and laid a long, cold bright bar across the polished oak floor. And she stood, half in it, and half out of it, beside the portrait of the great-grandmother and the ruby. He came along the gallery. He stopped a pace from her. "Inez?" "Adrian?" A pause. She looked at him. "I have thought about it," she said. "For the most part of 2 days I have thought about it. I have thought about it less in the night than I expected, because I was sleeping, which was unexpected. I have thought about it walking the long gallery, and the conservatory, and once with your mother in the cellars, where it is dark, and a person can think clearly, because there is nothing in the corner of one's eye to distract one." She turned a fraction toward the south windows, into the cold, bright bar of light. He saw her swallow once before she went on. "I have thought about Augsburg. I have thought about my brother. I have thought about Camberwell's offer, and your mother's, and the princess's. I have not thought, very much, about the thing one is supposed to think about in such cases, which is whether I love you. I know I am supposed to think about that. I do not, just yet, know the answer to that question. I have been a maid for 3 months, and a fugitive for 19, and the daughter of a man who has been gone for 18, and the part of me that knows how to answer that particular question has not been allowed out into the air for some time. I do not wish to lie to you about it. I would rather tell you what I do know. Tell me. I know that I have not been afraid of you in any moment of any day in this house, since the morning of the 2nd of August. I know that on the morning of the 18th of October, I crossed your study because some part of me had decided, 3 months before, that you were the kind of man it was worth taking a risk for." A coal in the fire dropped softly. She drew breath and went on. "I know that I would prefer not to leave this house. I know that I would prefer to walk in this gallery with you in the mornings, and read in your library in the afternoons, and dine at your mother's table when she condescends to come down from Marlow. I would prefer to do this not as your guest, but as a person whose presence in the house is not subject to a condition I cannot influence.
The slanting sun moved a finger's width along the polished oak between them. Neither of them noticed.
I know that on Thursday evening last, when you stood at the head of the table and the princess thanked me, I looked at you across the room and thought, for the first time, I would build a life with this man, if he asked me, on terms that allowed me to keep the parts of myself I have only just got back. I know that you have, this week, asked me on exactly such terms. I know that I did not expect that. I know that I am moved by it. And I know that I would like, please, very much, to be courted by you, in this house, on your mother's terms, for as many months as you will give me, and that I do not, at the end of those months, expect to wish to leave for Augsburg. She had not, in delivering this speech, looked away from him. She did not look away now. He, for his part, had not moved. He had listened with his hands behind his back in the way he had listened to her speak the German across the desk on the first morning. When she finished, he did not at once answer. He told her, after a moment, that it was also long and generous. She answered, in the same low register he had used at her, that she hoped it was correct. He said, simply, that it was. He took the half-pace forward that closed the distance between them. He did not touch her. He looked down at her face, at the color the morning sun had laid across her cheekbone, at the thin pulse he could now see, faintly, at the side of her throat, below the jet brooch she had not taken off since the Friday of the princess. Ines, he said. Adrian. He asked, very low, whether he might take her hand. She said yes. He took her hand. He did it slowly, the way a man unused to handling a thing of value handles it for the first time. He did not raise the hand to his mouth. He held it. He turned it, very slightly, palm up. He looked at the small, pale callus at the base of the thumb and the very faint, ghostly remnant of beeswax polish along the inside of the wrist, which she had, he noticed, not been able to scrub entirely away in the 11 days since her last morning at the chair rail in the green drawing room. He smiled, then, properly, for the first time since the morning of the 2nd of August. Thank you, he said. He pressed her hand once, gently, between both of his, and let it go. They walked the gallery together. They did not speak much. They walked from the 2nd window to the 5th, and then back, and then forward again, and stopped beneath the great-grandmother and her ruby for a moment at the 3rd pass. Outside the long south windows, the morning frost was almost entirely gone. The kestrel had not returned. The 3 months that followed were, by the Dowager Duchess's later reckoning, the most domestic and the most luminously happy 3 months that the house had contained since 1798, when she herself had been newly married to it, and she set that down, with some surprise, in her private journal at Christmas. The house itself seemed, very gradually, to settle into a different temperature. The morning room, which had been chiefly used by Mrs. Pemberton for the disposal of correspondence, became a place where 2 pots of coffee, one black and bitter the way Adrian liked it, one with hot milk and a single shaving of orange peel laid across the rim of the cup, the way Ines had taken it as a girl in Almodovar, were carried up at 8:30 every morning instead of 1. By a tacit arrangement no one had announced, the second armchair beside the fireplace acquired a small, persimmon-coloured cushion that the Dowager Duchess had sent down from Marlow with a single line in her hand. For the chair, child, not for you. He keeps the room cold. The library, similarly, acquired a small writing desk in the south window that had not been there in the previous Duke's time. On it appeared by Christmas a glass inkwell of unusual lapis color, 2 17th-century Spanish duodecimos in vellum bindings, whose pages still smelt faintly of the dry sun of Andalusia, and a small silver letter opener with a Toledo mark, whose bone handle was warm to the touch even in the coldest morning hour. The long gallery, on whose north wall the great-grandmother with the ruby continued her unblinking presidency, witnessed almost daily, between the 2nd and the 5th windows, between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, 2 figures walking slowly side by side, in conversation that more than one footman,
passing along the cross corridor, paused at the doorway to listen to, and then, blushing slightly, hastened on. Adrian and Inez walked the gallery in the mornings. They read in the library in the afternoons. They dined with the Dowager Duchess on her thrice-monthly descents from Marlow, and with Camberwell on his fortnightly visits up from town. And on every other evening, they dined together, in the small dining room, with the footman at a discreet remove, and a single candelabrum between them. They did not, at any point, hurry. Adrian developed, over the first 3 weeks, a quiet and entirely unself-conscious habit of bringing her books he thought she might find interesting and leaving them on the table by the south window of the library without comment. She developed, over the same 3 weeks, a habit of leaving notes inside the books, in a single sentence, in whichever of her 5 languages best fit the observation. He learnt a great deal of Italian very quickly. She learnt a great deal of patience about waiting for him to find words. He, for his part, learnt that her silence was almost never reproof, and that her laugh, when it came chiefly through her eyes. In the second week of November, the Foreign Office, in the person of Mr. Welkin, communicated by private letter to the Duke that the brother of one Inez Maria de Castel y Almodovar, Marquez in the 3rd generation, had been informed through a quiet diplomatic channel, but the young lady in question had taken up residence in a house of canonesses on the continent. Her dowry, the letter went on, was understood to have been redirected, with her own consent and witnessed signature, to the rebuilding of the said house's chapter house, and the British government would view any further inquiry into her present whereabouts as an unfriendly act. The brother had, with considerable speed and a perceptible sigh of relief, written a formal renunciation of all claim on his sister's person, and what remained of her property, and had thrown himself with renewed vigour into the management of his Andalusian vineyards. Inez read this letter twice, sitting at the window of the South Rose room. The afternoon light, weak November light, lay flat on her hands and on the page. She set the letter on her knee. Then she went down the stairs and along the corridor and into the library, and crossed to the long table where Adrian was working, and said, "He has let me go." Adrian set down his pen. He rose. He did not, in front of the steward who was also in the room, do anything beyond extending his hand across the table. But in his hand, when she took it, was an answer she had not needed to ask for. By the first week of December, the house had quietly begun to anticipate. Mrs. Pemberton, who had moved Inez's effects from the South Rose room to the suite that adjoined the Duchess's apartments, without either of them remarking on it, had her staff in hand. The Dowager Duchess, who descended from Marlow for a long weekend at the start of Advent, gave Inez her late mother-in-law's pearls, said merely, "These suit you, do not argue," and went back to Marlow before either of them could form a sentence about it. Camberwell brought up from town, in the last week of December, a small velvet case containing the great-grandmother's ruby, which had been reset, by his own discreet arrangement, into a pendant rather than a collar. "Your great-grandmother's collar would have throttled the woman, my dear. You may thank me later." And Inez, who had not anticipated being given a ruby, was, for the first time in her acquaintance with the old gentleman, briefly speechless, and recovered enough to thank him by kissing him on the cheek, which Camberwell, the Dowager Duchess noted in her journal, received with the demeanour of a man who has just been knighted unexpectedly in a private interview. Adrian, all this time, did not press. He waited. He read. He brought books. He learned, at her quiet instruction, the 4 Spanish phrases he most needed to be able to say to her grandmother in Cadiz, in the event that the old woman should one day be brought across the sea to a country where she did not speak the language. He learnt them in case, and he kept them. He courted her, in short, in the only way the Dowager Duchess had thought him capable of. Thoroughly, slowly, without theatre, and with the unwavering attention of a man who had, on a Wednesday morning in late October, looked across a Persian carpet at a woman in a charcoal gown with beeswax on her wrist, and decided, somewhere beneath conscious thought, but he intended to spend the rest of his life paying attention to her exactly the way she was paying attention to him. He told her this, finally, in plain words, in the library on the night of the 17th of February, with a hard frost on the lawn outside and the fire in the grate burning down to its last red half-hour.
He had been standing at the window. He had turned. He had said her name. He had crossed the room. He had taken both her hands in both of his. He had said, "Ines, I love you. And I've been trying not to say it for 4 months because you were entitled to the time, and the time has been used, and I cannot reasonably wait any longer to say it." And she, who had been waiting, who had known precisely when in the evening it would arrive, who had nevertheless put down the book in her lap with a small jolt that she had not been expecting, had risen and kissed him on the mouth, once, briefly, exactly, and said, very quietly against his coat, "Yo te oigo, Adrian. I hear you." And then, more steadily, in English, "I love you. I have known it since the second window of the long gallery. I was waiting to hear it from you." He held her for a long moment at the fire. He did not speak. He had, at last, run out of things he needed to say. They were married in the chapel of Ashbourne, in the 3rd week of April, in the soft new green of an English spring, by the rector of the village, and in the presence of the Dowager Duchess, Lord Camberwell, Mr. Welkin, who had, against expectation, become a close friend of the Duke's, Mrs. Pemberton, the steward, the head gardener, the head groom, the cook, the still-room cat, which had unaccountably managed to be in the chapel before anyone arrived, and was permitted to remain, and, by way of a small, hand-bound prayer book sent ahead from Augsburg with a German inscription, the absent good wishes of the canonesses of St. Augustine of the Upper Town. The bride wore the great-grandmother's ruby, reset, at her throat. The groom did not, in the entire course of the ceremony, take his eyes off her. The Dowager Duchess permitted herself one small, dignified weep at the moment of the rings, and Camberwell, with great gallantry, pretended not to have noticed. 6 months later, on a warm October afternoon at the very end of the haymaking, the new Duchess of Ashbourne stood in the bow window of the morning room in a gown of pale apricot muslin, with the ruby at her throat and the Dowager Duchess's spaniel asleep at her feet, and read aloud, in German, the latest letter from the Canoness's house at Augsburg. The Princess Caroline, now formally a postulant, had finished her novitiate's gardening duties for the season, and had been entrusted with the cataloguing of the chapter house library, which she found, she wrote, profoundly satisfying. She sent her sisterly love. She enclosed a pressed leaf from the apple tree in the inner cloister. She said, in a postscript in her own small German hand, that she prayed every Friday morning at chapter for Die Erweckte, the awake one, and that she hoped the awake one was sleeping well at last. Adrian, who had come in from the steward's office and had stopped in the doorway to listen without interrupting, crossed the room. He came up behind her. He set both hands lightly on her shoulders. He looked, over her head, at the apple leaf the princess had pressed into the page. He asked her, gently, whether she was sleeping well at last. She said that she was. She turned in the circle of his hands and put up her own hand in a gesture that had become, over the course of the spring and summer, as natural to her as breathing, and laid her palm against his jaw. He bent his head. He kissed her, briefly, on the mouth. Outside the long south windows of the morning room, in the empty, bright sky over the elm where the great kestrel had once hung, no bird hung now. None needed to. She did not need a sign anymore. If you have been with me by the fire to the end of this story, if you have walked with Inez down the long corridor with the wax of the chair rail still on her wrist, and stood at the side of the carved oak table while the princess thanked her, and heard the Duke at last find the words he had been unable to find for 4 months, I am very glad you stayed. I read every comment, in every language. Tell me, if you will, was there a moment in this long autumn when you found you were holding your breath? I should like to know which one. Subscribe if you have not already, and join me again next week. There is another fire,
another long corridor, and another door waiting to be opened. Until then,